This is Conversations with Cait, a podcast centered on the arts, culture, and race and gender politics. For today's topic, we will be discussing the power of education and importance of acknowledging history. Republicans and Democrats are divided as to what is to be taught to the children and how children are supposed to be educated in K-12 schools. How do we talk about sensitive issues like race or gender equality to the children? Dems say that GOP officials are banning books to erase history and that they're attacking education. Most recently, Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, a Republican, set up an email hotline for parents to report their concerns in an attempt to address and end what he called divisive concepts, including critical race theory. Now, listeners, I wrote this many times in my articles in the record. There is little to no evidence that it is taught in K-12 schools. I repeat, it is a graduate-level framework. Youngkin calls it political indoctrination. Here we go again, indoctrination. This is Conversations with Cait, and I am not here to indoctrinate, but to give you the facts. I'm sorry, I just had to do that. I'm just going to read you the executive order from Virginia Governor Youngkin. So I quote, "Political indoctrination has no place in our classrooms. The vast majority of learning in our schools involves impartial critical knowledge and skills in math, science, history, reading, and other areas that should be non-controversial. Inherently divisive concepts like critical race theory and its progeny instruct students to only view life through the lens of race and presume that some students are consciously or unconsciously racist, sexist, or oppressive, and that other students are victims. This denies our students the opportunity to gain important facts, core knowledge, formulate their own opinions, and to think for themselves. Our children deserve far better from their education than to be told what to think." End quote. Oh my goodness. I'm seriously curious as to what you all think about this email hotline for parents. Dems say that no, we're not telling them what to think. They formulate their own opinions. We need to address these topics. Do parents want their children to grow up to be narrow-minded and not think critically? Florida has also been in the news lately with their recent proposed legislation, Parents' Rights in Education, also known as the Don't Say Gay bill, which essentially prohibits a school district from encouraging classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity in primary grade levels. Chasten Buttigieg, the husband of Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, addressed his concern in a tweet saying, "This will kill kids, Ron DeSantis. You are purposefully making your state a harder place for LGBTQ kids to survive in." In a national survey, and he cited from the Trevor Project, 42% of LGBTQ youth seriously considered attempting suicide last year. Now they can't talk to their teachers? End quote. In addition, I'm not done talking about Florida yet. In another piece of legislation, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis backed up the Individual Freedom Bill, which states an individual should not be made to feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race. CNN reports that it would also prohibit employers from providing training or instruction that espouses, promotes, advances, inculcates, or compels individuals to believe that an individual bears responsibility for or should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment because of actions committed in the past by other members of the same race, color, sex, or national origin. Now, I've thrown a lot out there to wrap your head around. We've got Virginia's email hotline specifically for parents to address their concerns for political indoctrination, including CRT, Florida's Parents' Rights to Education, also known as the Don't Say Gay bill, and the Individual Freedom Bill. We need to talk about these topics. It's crucial in leading to understanding and critical thinking. But before we dive right into this, I want to introduce our guest speaker, Saladin Allah. He is the third great-grandson of famed Underground Railroad freedom seeker Josiah Henson, whom Harriet Beecher Stowe used as a primary narrative for her famous 19th century novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. Saladin is an elementary school educator and a Region 6 representative of the 5 Percenters in Western New York, Southern Ontario. He is also the founder of the Atlanta School for Gifted Youngsters, Atlantis Bill Talk Radio, and Quana Publishing. He is a featured historian in the IMAX film Into America's Wild, narrated by Morgan Freeman and hosted by Ariel Tweedo and John Harrington, and a featured historian in the 6-part docuseries Enslaved that is executively produced by and starring Samuel L. Jackson and directed by 3-time Emmy Award-winning journalist Simca Jacobovici. Saladin is the 2019 Martin Luther King Jr. Civil Rights Achievement Award recipient and is currently a commissioner for the Human Rights Commission in Niagara Falls and visitor experience specialist at the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center. He will share with us the story of Josiah Henson, the power of education, and discuss his thoughts on the GOP's actions on education. Good afternoon, Saladin. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good afternoon.
Can you tell our listeners about your great-great-great-grandfather, Josiah Henson?
Yeah, so my third great grandfather, Josiah Henson, he was a forerunner of the Underground Railroad. Those of you who study Underground Railroad history, you may be familiar with the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was a bestseller novel in the 19th century. It's written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And Harriet Beecher Stowe utilized my third great grandfather's life as the central narrative for her famous novel. A lot of people are not aware that she wrote a second book after she published Uncle Tom's Cabin because she got a lot of criticism from the public because this is the first time that the institution of slavery was actually depicted for the public. And that's one reason why it had such an impact in terms of the book sales and it being something that a lot of people were interested in learning more about. So a lot of people criticized her and said that the information that she put in the book wasn't accurate and it wasn't actually the truth. So she published a second book called The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in that book, she lists all of her references. And it is in that second book that she talks about my third great grandfather, Josiah Henson, by name, that she actually learned about his life through his biography that was actually published before her book, and it was circulating amongst abolitionist reading circles. So he was, like I mentioned, a forerunner of the Underground Railroad, which essentially means when he made his journey from the south to the north, Harriet Tubman, her name was Araminta at that time, and she was still a child on a plantation. And he left the South, Kentucky, and he left in about 1830, and he made that journey over 600 miles from Kentucky up here to Western New York and crossed at the foot of Ferry, which is known as Broderick Park in Buffalo, New York, in October of 1830. So it took him and his family a month to make that journey. He took his wife and his 4 children with him. 2 of them were so small, he had to carry them in a knapsack on his back. So he was a very courageous man and a genius as well. One of the things also that I tell people is that he wasn't literate. He didn't know how to actually read. He could read the environment, he could read people, but he couldn't actually read books. But he was intelligent and genius enough to be able to make this journey from the south to the north. Once he crossed over into Canada, he settled in a small community called Little Africa, which was located in Fort Erie, Ontario, Canada. And he lived there for some time until he eventually traveled further north, where he was able to successfully found the Dawn Settlement, which was a community of over 150 people at that time. And he was instrumental in constructing the British American Institute. And he would also come back and forth into the United States in the role of an abolitionist. And it was through him that my grandmother was born, Inez Dorsey Frank. She was born in St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada, and grew up in the same community of freedom seekers, such as Harriet Tubman's family. And it wasn't until 1925 that she moved into the United States. And eventually my father was born through my grandmother. I was born through my father and my mother. And that's part of the journey of my family and This is not anything that I just read in a book or saw in a documentary. This is something that I learned directly from my family. And it's an ancestry that I'm very proud of.
He found the Dawn settlement. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, when freedom seekers traveled across the Canadian side, sometimes they would return back into the United States after 1865 with the Emancipation Proclamation. Because a lot of times when people made these journeys, they made these journeys alone. And one thing that was unique about Josiah Henson's journey is he took his family with him. And it wasn't very common for people to take their entire family with them on these journeys. So oftentimes when freedom seekers would cross into Canada, sometimes they would return back into the United States to be reunited with their family, especially after 1865. But those who remained on the Canadian side established freedom seeker settlements. So we had settlements, like I mentioned, Little Africa, which was right in Fort Erie, which is right across the Peace Bridge in Buffalo, New York. But then you also had settlements right in Niagara Falls, Ontario, Canada. You had a settlement in Niagara-on-the-Lake. You had a settlement, like I mentioned, in St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada. So you had these various different communities of our people who established themselves on the Canadian side, so that when freedom seekers arrived there, they were not only greeted with love and compassion, but also those essentials such as food, clothing, and shelter, as well as employment. So the Dawn settlement was just one of many different freedom seeker settlements that were established on the Canadian side from our people who were leaving the United States seeking freedom.
You work as a visitor experience specialist at the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center. According to their website, you incorporate your personal history and your passion for youth education. Can you discuss more about this and your initiative, Atlantis School for Gifted Youngsters?
Yeah, so that's a little bit of territory to cover, but to start, as a visitor experience specialist at the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center, I've been a part of that institution since it opened in May of 2018. And one of my primary responsibilities is to lead our guests through tours of the facility through our signature program, which is called Freedom Conversation Tours. If you've never been to the space, I definitely encourage you to come to experience our Freedom Conversation Tours, because we have learned the technique of creating a type of safe space for our guests in order to discuss just challenging and difficult topics related to not only freedom seekers of the past, but modern day freedom seekers, and how some of those different journeys of the past are directly connected to social justice issues that are going on today. And these are the type of conversations that a lot of times people may not even feel comfortable having in their own household at the dinner table. But we provide that type of safe space where you can engage people from various different walks of life with their different perspectives and learn from one another and leave that space with the ability of being more of a change maker, knowing that you have the capacity to do something today. I'm also a community liaison at the Heritage Center. So any of the different type of collaborative programs or projects and initiatives that we have with other organizations and institutions and businesses, I'm the bridge that helps connect our Heritage Center to our community. The Atlanta School for Gifted Youngsters is an initiative that I established a few years ago, which is an early childhood learning center and an after school program. So I've been working with youth for well over 2 decades now. I know I don't look that old, but I got a little bit of gray in my beard right here. But my background is in early childhood education, and oftentimes being in that field, not just early childhood education, but education as a whole. As a Black man, I'm like a unicorn. You rarely ever see us in that position in terms of education. And when we're not in those spaces, a lot of times children of all walks of life don't get the benefit of learning about us in terms of a sense of cultural competence and seeing the perspective of life through our eyes as they've seen the perspective of life through many others' eyes. So the Atlanta School for Gifted Youngsters is my contribution to strive to create that space for our youth. Right now, I'm going through the process of renovating a space that I own in the city of Niagara Falls. The Atlanta School for Gifted Youngsters is a non-for-profit, and our logo is also trademarked with the United States Patent and Trademark Office as well. So this is probably like the, the most challenging and central project that I've been working on over the last few years, because it's really a combination of all of the various different work that I do, not only with youth, but also as a community organizer and author. I've published 23 different books. I create animation. So there's a variety of different things that I do, and they are centralized or they culminate in the establishment of the Atlanta School for Gifted Youngsters.
How does your third great grandfather inspire you?
Wow. So one thing that I tell people all of the time is you are really just a composite of all of those who came before you. And the more that you learn about those who came before you, you get greater insight into your own infinite potential as well as your capacity to meet obstacles and challenges. Your ancestors are like a reference library of life. And if you don't consult that reference library of life, there's a lot of different elements that you miss, not only about the things that have happened in the past, but a lot of the different subtleties or the different aspects of yourself that you may not have certain insight into. So thinking about my third great grandfather, Josiah Henson, in terms of his courageousness, his intelligence, his foresight in terms of being a community organizer, also an institution builder, all of those various different qualities are literally a part of me and a lot of the things that I actually do. And knowing that I had an ancestor that was successful in those type of undertakings before me not only encourages me, but also gives me insight into my own capacity to be able to accomplish the same type of goals. And he's just one root from my family tree. So I encourage people all of the time, they may not have an ancestor that was a part of the Underground Railroad, but if they live here in the United States, unless they are indigenous here, their family came from somewhere else. And their family has a story connected to the journeys where they came from. And it's important to know about those journeys and those stories because it allows you to be more equipped to write the story of your own life because you have a lot of reference material.
And what do you think that he would say about today's politics? Would you think that he would say that we came a long way or we still have like a long way to go, especially post-Trump era right now?
Well, when you think about our past generations, one of the biggest changes that exist today is the growth and development of technology and the accessibility of a lot of different things. But when you strip things down from the technology and you analyze just the social norms and the way in which people interact with each other, when you analyze legislation that may still be on the books today, that was the same type of legislation that was on the books 50 years ago, some of the things that appear to be different actually remain the same. So talking to some of my ancestors, and I'm talking about people who may be in their 70s right now or 80s, some of the things they realize are different today, but then some of the things they also recognize are the same old faces and the same old places that they were used to experiencing when they were growing up. So I think it's a little of both. I think that he would say that there are some things that are obviously different today, but then there are things that are obviously still the same.
There's been a lot going in our country, especially post-Trump era. Many argue that we are especially divided as ever. I wanted to know your thoughts with the GOP's actions on education. Their latest scare terms have been critical race theory. Even though there's little to no evidence that it's taught in K through 12 schools, they've been banning books with topics that shine a light on people of color, the LGBTQ plus community, and sexual health. Most recently, a Tennessee school board banned Mouse, a Pulitzer Prize winning graphic novel about the Holocaust. Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin set up an email hotline for parents to address their concerns if they suspect that teachers are initiating, and I quote from his executive order, divisive concepts like critical race theory. What are your thoughts on this as an educator?
Number one, you can't stop the truth. So you can do whatever you want, but what it does is it brings more light to the things that you don't want people to actually investigate. It's no different than if I brought, for example, as an early childhood educator, and I have a bunch of 5-year-olds in my class,
Mhm.
and I point over to a door and say, listen, class, no one go over near that door. Don't touch the knob of that door. Whatever's in that room, you're not supposed to look in there. It's bad in there. And guess what they're going to do?
They're gonna do it anyway.
Yes, that's going to be the first thing that they do. Right. So seeing the type of legislation, it's really counterintuitive, because the present generation that I see working with youth, they have not only the access to resources and tools as critical thinkers,
Hmm.
but they also have the capacity to be able to problem solve in a way that maybe people in our past generations may have not had the capacity. You know, there's also a sense of fearlessness that I see with a lot of our present generation. So seeing the type of postures and political moves that some of these adults are making, a lot of youth that I see, they are going to be the ones that are going to be the ambassadors of the type of future that we won't see that type of legislation. We won't see the type of moves that people are making politically because they are evolving with a different level and stream of consciousness than I've ever seen before. So it doesn't worry me. I'm hopeful because I see the type of hope in the eyes of the youth every single day. And when I see a lot of the problems and the issues that's going on, it's usually adults.
Yeah.
No, it's not a lot of the youth that are having these issues and problems and this divisiveness. And no, it's a bunch of adults arguing and creating these type of narratives that are divisive. When it comes to the two different news stations that are always being combated, these are a demographic of adults that are into this type of content that is on television. Youth are creating their own content, such as yourself,
Thank you.
and creating these type of platforms that are sharing their own perspectives on how they see things. When we look at just over the past several years, a lot of the different movements that have taken place in terms of institutional changes, that has been largely a demographic of younger people who have been pushing the narratives to create this type of change. If you go all the way back to what happened in Ferguson, that wasn't a bunch of adults. You know, you look at any of these movements and you look at the demographics, it's not a bunch of older people who are retired that's making these type of moves that have the energy to shift these paradigms. It's younger people. And I think that some of the legislation that's being passed without younger people in the room is being done to strive to preserve the identity and the trajectory of older people who are in these positions or seats of power who are afraid for their life to be able to give that power over to the next generation. So I see a lot of fear, but I don't see a lot of fear in the hearts and in the minds of younger people.
You're listening to Conversations with Cait, a podcast centered on the arts, culture, and race and gender politics. Be a part of the conversation. What are your thoughts on the GOP's actions on education? How about Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin's email hotline for concerned parents for reporting teachers and use of the term divisive concepts? What about Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' Don't Say Gay bill? Let me know in the social media comments on this episode's wrap-up article on the Buffalo State Record. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel or follow me on Instagram at CAIT_MALILAY_rights. Regarding the book bans on topics related to racial equality and the LGBTQ plus community, what are your thoughts on this as an educator?
I think that not only topics about the LGBTQ plus community or maybe topics dealing with other different things, depending upon the age of the children, certain things are developmentally appropriate or age appropriate. I see some people who are pushing narratives or striving to expose younger children to topics that developmentally they're not there yet, right? And when you have adults that don't understand that, then it can create a problem in terms of that child's development. Whereas maybe it was that parent or guardian's responsibility to introduce certain subjects or conversations with children, not you as an educator or an administrator or a school district. So I say that to say it's a very slippery slope and it's a very fine line between programming and socializing and educating. So when you think of education, it comes from the Latin root "ducere," which means to draw out. And a lot of times you don't see educators really educating, really just looking at a child and striving to draw out of them what's already present in them and encouraging them to be critical thinkers. A lot of times you see adults striving to push their own narrative and what they think into the minds of a child. When there's a child in my classroom and they're having conversations amongst their peers or even with me, I can see where they get certain things from. And I can also see if they thought about things on their own and drew their own conclusion. And a lot of times they're repeating things that they heard in their environment from adults that oftentimes are just not educated at all,
Yeah.
you know? So even if you have school districts that ban certain type of books, that makes books more popular. You
That's
know, you
true.
have
It
the
makes you want to read
opposite.
it like the door example that you gave. They're going
Yeah,
to read it anyway or
yeah,
open the door anyway.
yeah. So one thing that you can do is if children are already engaged having a certain type of conversation, you can strive to figure out a way to help facilitate that conversation in a healthier direction, as opposed to just maybe leaving children to their own devices if they don't really have any scientific basis on the things that they're talking about or any type of resources to have a better understanding of the things that they're talking about or that they've been exposed to. You can strive to meet them where they are as opposed to striving to bring them where you think they need to be. And I think as adults, sometimes we have a very bad habit of doing that instead of just taking the time to strive to meet children where they are, you know? And, I
Mhm.
also do see in terms of a LGBTQ plus agenda, that you have people who are part of that community that are also far right,
Yeah.
you know? Um, and then you have some people who are part of that community that are far left, right? I think that sometimes people get this impression that the LGBTQ community is a monolith. You know, it's just one big happy family. You see racism even within that community. You see
Absolutely.
ageism even within that community. You see white supremacy even within that community, right? And I think
Mhm.
it's important to realize that um, that everything is not just painted with a broad brushstroke, and you have to be very mindful in terms of how you engage and communicate with others, because you never necessarily know the type of terrain that you may find yourself on. Uh, in terms of diversity and multiculturalism and just learning about all the human families of the planet Earth, I think that is also critical to us developing an understanding about one another and a tolerance for one another. And whenever you're striving to ban this or marginalize this or tell this person they can't say this or they can't say that, you run the risk of creating more of what it is that you say that you don't like, you know? So it's good to strive to learn about one another. You don't necessarily have to be into or agree with what everybody else does, or you don't have to expect everybody to agree with you, but you should at least be invested in striving to understand one another, because that understanding is really the highest degree of love. And it's difficult to love one another if you just have no understanding about people or where they come from, what their perspectives are, and what's important to them.
Is there a certain age where you think diversity should be taught?
You're born learning about diversity. When you're born a baby by nature is learning to distinguish their senses. And naturally, they learn to distinguish or what's diverse about their sense of sight from their sense of taste or touch or hearing. That's something that naturally happens. Now, the problem is when you have people who strive to curate that natural experience by striving to limit or marginalize or separate children from having that full experience of various different people, places, and things. And I'm not talking about just taking a child and putting them into any kind of situation that may be uh, insecure or vulnerable. I'm talking about if you live in a neighborhood, in a community, and you clearly have neighbors who are from Pakistan, it's important that your child learns about your neighbors. You have people who live right next door to someone like that, and they won't allow their children to even play with them. You know, so they
Mhm.
create these type of walls instead of building bridges. And a
Mhm.
part of building those bridges is making sure that children are exposed to the human families of the planet Earth, that their perspective is not the only perspective in life. The food that you eat is not the only food that everyone eats, and it may definitely not be the most healthy. So it serves you the benefit of learning about the perspective of others, because that helps enrich your cultural experience and can help extend your life if you're open to those different perspectives. So I think that that natural growth and development of a human being a part of a human family that is diverse, is something that we should embrace and not strive to curate or to limit or to separate ourselves from.
And why is it important to tell these stories?
Because number one, the main goal of us as beings is to expand our life cycle and to perpetuate the species so that we can continue the legacy of those that came before us. Uh, the stories are, like I mentioned earlier, our reference material to our library of life. And the less knowledge that we have, the less wisdom that we also have access to, because you can't make wise decisions if you don't know nothing.
Mhm.
You live long enough, you realize that, you need to know a little something first before you think you're making wise decisions. And that knowledge and wisdom also leads to understanding. And that knowledge is not just data or information. That knowledge or that information or awareness are the stories of us as not only as a human family, but you can read the stories within nature. When you study plant and animal life, there's stories there as well. So those stories or reference material in the library of life helps enrich our experience as human beings, but it also gives us the possibility of expanding our life cycle and contributing more beauty to this world as opposed to perpetuating the things that we see that are broken.
Back to the question about education. Do you think that Virginia Governor Youngkin and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, do you think that they mean well in their actions on education?
Yeah, I think that their constituents,
Mhm.
their community members, who they represent, I think in their heart of hearts, they really believe and think that they're doing the right thing. And that is the epitome of ignorance. That's the epitome of ignorance. And what's worse than ignorance is arrogant ignorance. Arrogant ignorance. So, going back to what I was talking about in terms of the importance of diversity and realizing that we're a human family and it's important to learn about the various different perspectives of our human family members, the different policies that they stand upon, you can tell that it does not consider certain members of the human family. A consensus was not the approach in why they see the importance of creating certain type of legislation, because it clearly marginalizes or leaves some community members out. So I think that they're working in the best interest of their own constituents. And unfortunately, most of those constituents do not look like you or me. And I think that's also why it's important for us to always learn and be invested and involved in the political process, because the more marginalized that we are, the less voice that we have in terms of creating a type of body politic that enables us to wield the power to shift what we see that is happening in politics. We have to have the ability to do that, or we're just going to be on the sidelines complaining why people are taking legislation to change the landscape where we live, which usually will not be in our favor or equitable at all.
Florida has also been in the news lately with the recent proposed legislation, Parent Rights to Education, also known as the Don't Say Gay bill, which essentially prohibits a school district from encouraging classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity in primary grade levels. In addition, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis also backed up the Individual Freedom Bill, which states an individual should not be made to feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race. What is your response to this? Many critics say that it's as a way to make white people not feel guilty.
That legislation does not change people's attitudes. When we look at the legislation historically in this country, when slavery was abolished in 1865, people still looked at people who were of African descent as slaves, even today.
Mhm.
You may just go online or look at certain type of advertisements that come out, and you can just see the disparity in power dynamics and how people who are of African descent still are looked at best, second class citizens, right? So I say
Yeah.
that to say this type of legislation that they're striving to create, it's not going to change people's feelings. You can sit there and say you can't have classroom discussions about sexual orientation, If you're an educator and you're especially working with youth who are going through puberty, they're having that discussion, regardless of what you want to say about it. That's usually the hot topic that they're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, as an educator, you may not have the capacity to teach a lesson about it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're not in that position to be able to provide some scientific evidence and to help facilitate some healthy discussions around those topics, you're leaving these children who are going through this process to their own devices, which usually is not the best trajectory because they're just having this conversation amongst themselves. So time is usually the best indicator of the choices that we make. And I think by enacting a bill like this, it's going to be no limit of time where they realize that this may have not been the best thing that we should have done. And they're going to see the evidence that not only just in terms of the type of critique or criticism that they're going to get, but also the academic evidence and the social emotional evidence in the development of the children who are going to be exposed to this bill within these school districts. They're going to be able to measure the difference in their academic performance and the things that they're learning from now after that type of bill is actually passed. And they're not going to be able to look away from that and not look at that data for what it actually is. You know, we can't be afraid to have conversations with our students and our children. And with this change in landscape that we see academically in this country, some adults have the brilliant idea of let's just not talk about it.
Yeah.
That'll work. We're not just going to talk about it. You know, that's never worked.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and if we're supposed to be the vanguards of education, we need to be having these tough conversations with our future leaders because that's what they are. And if we're not, then we're doing ourselves a disservice by not equipping our future leaders with all of the resources that they need to be the critical thinkers and the compassionate citizens that we need to lead this country and this world forward. Because eventually this world is going to be handed over to them, and we should make sure that the children that we're handing this world over to are better prepared than we were. And it's unfortunate that a lot of adults are not taking that approach.
Absolutely. And a lot of, I have a lot of these discussions with my friends at school. Sometimes we're incredulous to think these are people that are in Congress and they talk like this. Some of the things that come out of their mouth or some of the things that they tweet, even if they say something wrong, they apologize in a tweet. And it makes it like less personable. Like anybody could have wrote that. It could have been their press secretary who wrote that social media comment.
Exactly. And the thing about it too is nowadays the highest value is in content. You
Mm-hmm.
know, 15 years ago, a news story or the news cycle lasted more than 72 hours. If some news broke on Monday, people were still talking about it by the end of the week. Nowadays, with the growth of social media, with the limited word count that you can use on Twitter or Facebook or some of these other different social media platforms, it has rehardwired people's attention span. Even when you look at social media with a scrolling function, it's not designed for a person to maintain a certain level of attention over a certain time period. I mean, even when you look at articles that are written today, a lot of times right beneath the title of the article, they have listed how much reading time that you're going to have to invest in that, maybe 2-3 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I say all of that to say technology has reshaped the consciousness of people, and it has also shortened the life cycle of content and news stories. So a story that could have lasted a week years ago, that is only going to be a hot topic for one day. And now people are going to be looking for what's the next hot topic. That's old news. That happened yesterday. And it's
Yeah.
like the next day, people just totally forgot about what somebody just said or did.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes you have news news platforms that use this to their advantage. They ration out pieces of information in order to stretch an entire story. They could have just gave you the whole story on Monday, but they just put a little piece out on Monday. And then on Tuesday say, oh, we have more updated information, and put a little piece out on Tuesday so that they could maintain the type of web traffic that will allow them to monetize this content. So it's the same thing with people who are in these positions of so-called power. Sometimes they deliberately just say something ignorant because they know it's going to get attention, and they're going to trend on Twitter.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder about that from our political representatives when they say something very outlandish, or even, let's say, if their news source is not doing so well. Like when Fox News was making a big deal about Joe Biden getting scoops of ice cream. I wonder, like, is it to get traffic?
Absolutely. Even if they say that it's not, it served that purpose. It
Mm-hmm.
served that purpose. And all you got to do is say, oh, I'm sorry, I take that back. Well, now you get even more people to come and see the so-called BS apology that you just made. It's all theatrics.
Mm-hmm.
It's all stagecraft. And it's very difficult a lot of times to see through what's really genuine nowadays. And that's also why education is so important in terms of helping our youth develop critical thinking skills so that they can figure things out for themselves, not just accept what people are telling you. I
Yeah.
saw a Democratic National Convention one time, and
Mm-hmm.
there was a guy that came on, and he was so proud. He was talking about how now more than ever, and this was like a few years ago, pre-pandemic, he was so proud and was just talking about how they built so many more hospitals and they have so many more beds for people in hospitals, and people were applauding that, and they were so happy that we have more hospitals than ever before, we have more beds. And I'm like, are you listening to what he's not saying? He's really telling you that there are people who are more sick than they've ever been before.
Yeah, he's
That's
trying to
what he's
hide
really saying.
that, but
That's what he's really saying.
switch the agenda with
Yeah.
his words. Like rhetoric is like one of my favorite words, but it's really like crucial to have that critical eye when you're analyzing like your world or what you're consuming, the information you're consuming.
Yeah. And rhetoric has nothing to do with wisdom, which is right discernment. It has nothing to do with what's right. It's
Mm.
just somebody saying whatever they want to say. You know, it's a sleight of hand. It's magic.
And also, what you said earlier about, African Americans being second class citizens, I was just thinking about when Mitch McConnell made that comment when he separated African American voters from American voters, and everybody caught that. I mean, that just shows like the ignorance about some of our politicians or what they're subconsciously thinking when they have a slip. He couldn't even, I'm not sure if you saw that in the news, but he couldn't even figure out the word. And his press secretary had to tell him, no, Mitch, that's not the word. It's other Americans. And he kept saying almost. He said almost Americans. It's like he can't think for himself. Is it really the politicians who are doing the speaking, or is it their advisors?
Yeah. And that's how he and his constituents really feel. And even the larger problem is, what are we going to do about that? What are people going to do about it? you know, but be mad and reshare it and add to his reelection campaign, you know? it's a very crafty way that people do things. You know, when they say that bad press is better than no press at all, that is definitely true, especially when it comes to the game of politics. You know, and people don't care. They say whatever they want. We had a president that was elected that was the most crude, knuckle dragging, lowbrow human being that you can ever think of in that type of presidential position. But there was a large segment of the population that identifies with that, you know, and that really represented the face of this country.
Yeah, and it's back to your point about the things that he said. Rhetoric and wisdom are very two separate concepts, and he illustrates just that.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think was a benefit that did come out of his presidency is the fact that he exposed how parochial or how elementary politics can be, because he wasn't speaking in a political language. And that made that political arena accessible to people that have never even thought about politics before. Because now he's speaking a layman's language that the average person could actually understand. So I've seen a lot of people who would never even have conversations, children even, who would never even have conversations about politics or anything like that, now just being interested in it because they had a person that made it so personable to them and crude that it allowed them access to learn about something that prior to that they might have been intimidated, because you had people using 4 and 5 syllable words that just went right over their head.
Saladin, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. They can just simply go to Google and put in Atlantis School for Gifted Youngsters and go down the rabbit hole, and it'll take you exactly where you need to be. We have quite a few events that are scheduled specifically for Black History Month all throughout the month. I encourage people to simply go to our website by going to Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center.org. I'm going to be teaching a workshop for youth, teaching them animation.
Thank you for listening to Conversations with Cait, a podcast centered on the arts, culture, and race and gender politics. Be a part of the conversation. What are your thoughts on this episode's discussion? Let me know in the social media comments on this episode's wrap-up article on the Buffalo State Record. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel or follow me on Instagram at CAIT_MALILAY_rights for updates on future articles and episodes.